My name is Lavada Nahon, and I am the interpreter of African American history for New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation, Bureau of Historic Sites. I'm also a culinary historian, 17th through 19th century New York history. I first learned or got curious about New York history because of the period rooms at the Brooklyn Museum. And because I had always cooked and loved cooking and had done a lot of outdoor food work because I was a Girl Scout, I just got curious about it and started studying the Dutch, and then learned about the New York Culinary Historian Society and slowly got involved, started taking classes from an academic standpoint, learning food history. And then on a vacation, my ex-husband and I came up to the Hudson River Valley and took a tour of Van Cortlandt Manor. And they had a series of hearth cooking classes. And in a year, I took almost every class they had. And then I asked the site director if she would be willing to trade private time on the hearth for my time as a volunteer. And she said yes. And so that was my gateway into really getting into the period that I study and New York history, pre-emancipation, and it is the period of New York history that most people are not aware of. For most of us, we went to school, the 13 colonies were under British control, but New York was actually started by the Dutch. It was part of a larger landmass called New Netherland that encompassed New York, New Jersey, Delaware, northern Pennsylvania, and southern Connecticut. And they set the structure that we live under today. Many of those Dutch families, even when the English took over, just became English in style, English in their manner, but it was really the groundwork had already been laid. And it is also through the Dutch that Africans and people of African descent are introduced to this area, with the first 11 arriving in 1626. Many of the Dutch merchants were also slave traders. So the Dutch had ports in Congo. So our initial enslaved are coming out of Congo. They're coming out of Angola. A lot of the initial were from Angola, direct trade. Those initial men who came in or were bought in 1626 actually had Portuguese and Spanish names, because Portugal had been in the Congo since the late 14th century, and by the early 15th century the king had converted to Christianity. So they had a long established relationship. Congo was invading Angola at the time, by the time we get to the beginning of the slave trade. So they're bringing them in from those ports. One area, however, that is very unique, I believe, to New York is that the Frederick Phillips imported people from Madagascar. So here in New York, our base is actually Angolan, Congo, and people from Madagascar. Unless you've gone to school really within the last 7 years in New York, you grew up like everyone did. The 13 colonies were controlled by the British. We learned enslavement pretty much connected to the South and the Civil War. Recently, because of the 1619 project, again, eyes have been focused on Virginia, eyes are focused on the South. So we grew up with that idea of a plantation, a large farm, worked as one unit with a resident labor source. Here in New York, we don't really have those traditional plantations. We start in the Dutch period with what were called patroons. And a patroon is a large tract of land that the owner of that land is responsible for populating. When the English come in 1664, we then switch to their system, which is the manor system. It is that medieval manor system. You have one man or one group of people or a family owning a large tract of land. Say, for instance, Phillipsburg Manor was 52,000 acres, Van Cortlandt Manor was 86,000 acres, Rensselaerwyck was nearly 1 million acres. The family only controlled a portion of that land, generally near a large water source. because our cash crop becomes wheat. So that water source is providing power for the grist mills. The rest of the land is broken into smaller farms, 150, 200 acres in size, and those are leased to Northern European tenants. Those tenants, as well as the owner of that land, need labor, and that labor force, as it is throughout the hemisphere, is enslaved Africans. So one of our challenges here, because we all grew up with that plantation system and that one large labor force of like hundreds of people in one location, living in almost a small village behind that house, maintaining African traditions, maintaining African foodways. When we get to New York, we lose that because you have a large part of the population is enslaved, but they're scattered. So it is common then for perhaps the main families, the elite families, their domestic servants are predominantly enslaved. We have then tenant farmers having enslaved people. We have middling people owning enslaved people. There are places where it's like 2 out of every 3 houses there's an enslaved person, but they're like 1 here, 2 there, another 9 over here, another 12 over here. So without seeing that, but also because we don't have that trigger word of plantation, we think, oh, well, enslavement isn't that bad here, or it's not that many people here. And also because of the way we learned it in school, slavery was generally connected to, one, the South, but also the Civil War. And during that period, enslavement has ended in Canada, and New York is the place that people travel through. So we always reference it as a place of people traveling through. They may settle here, but they're free here. When in fact, the Underground Railroad started at the same time enslavement was still in existence in New York. So there is that overlap. The enslaved Africans and their descendants do maintain some of the cultural traditions. One of the ones that we want people to maintain first and foremost is the foodways. And that is the biggest challenge because cooking is expensive, right? We don't really think about that. But in the 18th century, when you have firewood that can be used as a cash commodity, when you have those iron pots that have to be imported, and you only have one enslaved person on your property, it is easier for you to keep them working than it is for you to allow them time to cook for themselves. I really question, and especially after all of the years I have of study, how much of the culinary traditions we are retaining. Recently, I came across a quote by a woman named Mrs. Knight, and she was traveling from Boston and would eventually end up in New York. But she ends up at a tenant farmer's house in Connecticut. And her comment is that she is really appalled that this enslaved person is eating at the table with the family, and that his black paw is in the same dish as her white hand. And that, to me, it's as close as we can get to really what is happening in New York. If a woman on a farm, we have some farms like Maybe Farm, has 9 enslaved men on it, I just don't see those men cooking for themselves. I see the woman preparing something for them and then them cooking. Because truly, in traditional African cultures, men don't cook. Women cook. And so are they capable? Probably. But since they are the labor force, I would tend to think that the enslaver is going to have them working as long as they can in a day and then give them whatever. Because one of the things we know consistently across the board when remains have been examined, they're all underfed. How does an individual enslaver view the human being that they are enslaving? that is on the individual choice. Those are the levels of relationships that we have some evidence of in both directions. We have evidence at some point, particularly as we get closer to the manumission happening, where people are allowing their enslaved to choose their own owners. But that is at the end of New York's enslavement period. Each case has to be taken individually. But to say that they lived in the house so they were treated like family is not true. They didn't have their own bedrooms. The evidence is showing, as it shows up in Sojourner Truth's narratives, if they're in the basement, that basement is wet, damp, cold, and unfinished. We have documented garret spaces that are small, narrow, and hot. We have places where doors are locked and people are inside. So that concept of a gentler enslavement is just like, let it go. Just let it go. Because if they cared so much about their humanity, they wouldn't own them in the first place. It's not Black history. It's not white history. It's American history. And as Americans, we need to come to terms with the fact that our country was a slave society, period.